Hello everyone and welcome to our open news meeting. I'm James Harding, I'm the editor and co-founder of Tortoise, and I'm really happy and grateful and even a touch hopeful, Gayle, to welcome you back. Gayle Smith, who is the chief executive of the One campaign, fresh from trying to do a absolutely colossal job at the State Department in terms of getting a COVID vaccine program to run globally. And Gayle, the reason we were so keen to have you back, and thank you for your time tonight, is that if I'm honest, I feel like we as a newsroom, and you could say quite a lot of the media is stuck around COVID. And I hope that having some time with you, having the course of this hour, we can really begin to understand how government is working, particularly global government is working, how activism is or isn't working, and how we as people seem to have kind of lost a touch of compassion for those people on the other side of the world, and try and understand all of that together. I should say there's a kind of healthy and positive thing simply about having this conversation tonight, because as you may have noticed, in the UK, we're talking mostly about parties that shouldn't have been held and that none of us were invited to. This is intended to be an open news meeting where we focus on something that's been a work of ours since the middle of the last summer, as you know, the arms race, this question about the global vaccination campaign. For those Tortoise members who are thinking, when are we going to get to Boris Johnson? Well, we're going to do it tomorrow night. We're going to do Sue Gray and all of that tomorrow night. But Gayle, as you know, with our think-ins, they're really just open news meetings. It's a bit like an editorial board. So I hope that lots of my colleagues in the newsroom, lots of our members will weigh in and give you kind of their perspective on things. I wonder whether we could start just by how you found the US administration. You know, this is not the first time you've worked in US government,
no,
but it was the first time, as I understand it, going into a job like that in an administration which was consumed by a domestic agenda, trying to figure out a way of delivering internationally. And I wonder what you judge was the state of the State Department and the international effort around the COVID vaccine campaign.
Yeah. No, thanks for the question. Thanks for having me. It's great to be back. I love when you do these things. So interestingly, I found a couple of things. One, I found that the global landscape has changed dramatically, right? I mean, I think many of us saw the previous 4 years as a period where multilateralism was shaken up, things politically shifted in a number of countries, and the impact of that was still being felt. I mean, we are still a very divided country, and one that in many cases was divided deliberately. It's still a very intense political environment. President Biden came into office facing a huge number of challenges, not the least of which was a raging pandemic within the borders of the United States. But what I found was an administration that was ready to move on the international side, which is one of the reasons that the Secretary of State asked me to come in, which was to help ramp up the international response. And I think we were actually able to do that. We built a machine and a platform for distributing vaccines around the world. Just today, the White House announced that they've now got to 400 million vaccines shipped out to countries all over the world. That's a pretty good number. We did the big buys for Pfizer. We also did a couple of other things. I think the president pulling world leaders together in September, and then the Secretary of State pulled foreign ministers together in November. Those were the first times, almost 2 years in, that world leaders had met exclusively on the pandemic, or foreign ministers had met exclusively on the pandemic. So I think those were things that were able to get something started. So, on balance, I feel positive about what I was able to do with a team of very good people in terms of kicking a global response into gear. Where I think we've still got an uphill climb is the world is still nowhere near where we need to be, and we're now in the third year.
And Gayle, forgive me, I suppose I should frame this in terms of how we started looking just at Tortoise as a small newsroom, really exercised by global vaccinations, after the Carbis Bay, the Cornwall summit of the G7. And the thing that really, I suppose, inflamed us was the sense the Sunday before the G7 summit that Boris Johnson signaled that he was going to try to secure the commitment of the G7 leaders to end the pandemic by the end of 2022, i.e. make sure that everyone signed up to, in effect, 11 billion, as it was then described, 11 billion doses of the vaccine by then. And then at the G7 summit, you'll remember, only 1 billion doses were claimed. Even that number was probably a stretch. It was probably more like 600 to 700 million. And I couldn't believe, and lots of Tortoise members and colleagues in the newsroom couldn't believe that when you had such an obvious problem and that it was financially so fixable, that there wasn't the political either leadership or coordination to deliver on that. And now in the beginning of January, I think COVAX has delivered 1 billion, but you're still in a world, aren't you, where 10% of Africans are vaccinated and 60% of the world is.
Yeah.
So can you just explain for us, because, you know, people I don't know who have followed Gayle's career will know this, but, you know, this isn't the first time you've dealt with a pandemic. You dealt with the Ebola crisis, didn't you, in sort of 13, 14. What's broken here? What's changed?
That's absolutely the right question, James. And I think, but just as a point of fact, a lot was said about wanting to get the world to sign on to a plan for the G7. That wasn't actually the lead up to the G7. The lead up to the G7 and the decisions on vaccines came late. And again, that's when we did the big Pfizer purchase. But I think a few things are broken. I think multilateralism as a default, right, as a very natural default. Mm-hmm. It became evident to me, and I think it's still evident now, that multilateralism has been severely damaged by, I think, in some cases, it's weaknesses of institutions. In other cases, it is the forthright and deliberate decision of some countries to avoid using them and, in fact, to try to damage them. No names, you can figure out what I'm talking about here. So that's number one. So the automaticity that was there in Ebola, that was there in the fight against AIDS, it was like you had to glue it back together. So that's number one. Number two, governments everywhere were focused inward. You know, some of the highest rates of incidents and death are in G7 countries, and there was a necessary focus inward, but attached to that was a insufficient connecting of the dots, right? The way to reduce the impact of the pandemic at home for any G7 country is to end it everywhere.
Yeah.
I think the frame, however, got set as a little bit of an old-fashioned charitable, oh, we've got to help the developing world, rather than a big we. This wasn't like a crisis where the G7 countries were fine. Poor countries were experiencing something different and therefore needed support and solidarity. This is something where we're all in the same boat, but it's a little bit stuck in the old, in my view, in the old framework. The last thing I will say, and then I'll turn it back to you, but I think something that is in shorter supply now than at any time in my life is compassion. And, you know, I get that enlightened self-interest, that's a good argument. That's a totally fair argument. But I don't think compassion has reared its head in the way I've seen it occur, again, whether Ebola, HIV, AIDS, the earthquake in Haiti in 2010, in the big crises we've seen around the world.
Gayle, I want to come back to that, because I think that, you know, my colleague Matt D'Ancona and I and my colleague Laura Spitt, I'm going to bring them in a second, had a really, really dispiriting conversation about activism, about the extent to which, if you do all the things that we did 10 years ago, they don't seem to work now, right? And I want to just sort of have a think about that in a second. But can I just stay with you in the State Department for a little bit longer?
Sure.
Because one of the questions that I had was, if you if, as you say, and I didn't realize this, that in the run up to G7, actually, there wasn't serious talk about getting on with a global vaccine effort.
And there was discussion about vaccines. I don't know that the discussion was, we need to have a plan. No, I think it was a bit, we all need to do more rather than how do we all do enough.
But my understanding, I mean, for what it's worth, my understanding from the UK end was that the Sunday night before, when Boris Johnson was making those comments about getting everyone together, everyone who was working as the Sherpa, at least at the UK end, was like, well, listen, we don't have a plan for that. In fact, we haven't even asked people for the money to do that. It was a kind of rhetorical flourish rather than a plan.
Yeah.
But my question to you about the State Department is, there was a very touching moment when Tony Blinken was up in front of the Senate committee and being asked actually by a Republican to say, you know, why isn't this a moment for the US to step in terms of its single leadership in the world? And I just wondered whether there were discussions that you had that said, look, yes, multilateralism is broken, right? The system's not working, but we are at the end of, whichever way you look at it, a 20-year run where US leadership has in different ways been questioned in the world. Why don't we do this ourselves? Why don't we do another PEPFAR and just do it on COVID? It's not going to break the bank, and it is going to really deliver for us in terms of influence and power in the world.
Yeah, you know, to some extent, that was the discussion. But I want to clarify on a couple things. The notion that the US was going to do this alone was never in the cards. I mean, President Biden was very clear when he gave remarks, I think it was in May, saying we're quite prepared to lead, but we're not going to do it alone. But if you look at the scale and ambition of PEPFAR, what did he do? We bought 1 billion vaccines in addition to sharing hundreds of millions from our own stocks. We have spent billions of dollars. Can the United States do more? There is no question. What I think hasn't happened sufficiently, some of it got started with the summit. We've got an opportunity. There's going to be another summit hosted by President Biden. There's going to be the G7 coming up hosted by Germany. Is we've got to glue this together better so that, again, we don't have lots of countries doing more and we've got a collection of countries doing enough. And that's the gap we've got.
And do you really think that? Do you think that there's going, I mean, I can't see what the multilateral setup is that worked from here.
The multilateral setup that worked or would work?
That would work from here, yeah.
You know, actually, I don't think it's that hard. I think we've got the tools. You've got COVAX. You've got the Africa Vaccine Acquisition Trust covering quite a bit in Africa. We've got the IMF playing an extraordinary role. We've got WHO. We've got the Global Fund. We've got the institutions. We have the resources if we're willing to put them on the table, right? It's going to be far cheaper to do this than to pay for the impact over time. We've got the science and the expertise. What needs to happen is that the world needs to organize itself. We're still, I think, a little stuck in every country doing something and not enough glue between and among them, if you will. So I think part of it is how do we put that glue in place? And I think another thing, and it's not the singular thing, but a very striking difference for me, this being my third time in government, is in fact the UK, because you know I've experienced a career where the UK was the leader through DFID in the kind of analysis and thinking that was needed for this, that had a public statement of priorities with 0.7 and had the resources with those 8 allocations behind 0.7. That's very different today. And again, it's not the singular thing, but it's another development that has had impact.
Gayle, can we get into just a judgment on where we are? Because one of the things I'd like to come out this evening is, for those of us who are involved in some way or another with our arms race campaign, I'd like to come out with a better plan for 2022, of what we try to do. And part of our thinking about being an open newsroom is even in the kind of planning of our campaigns, we sort of think those things through together. I'm going to turn to Lara Spirit, who's been trying to kind of organize our data. I'm going to ask her just to put to you sort of where we think we are in terms of the numbers, where we think we are in terms of vaccination levels, funding of COVAX, waste of doses, and just see whether or not you think that's right, whether or not you think our sort of read on it is right. And then I'm going to bring in my colleague Matt in a minute to talk about why we feel as though we're sort of slightly stuck in terms of how best to campaign. So Lara, do you want to go first? And,
Hi, thanks, Gayle, for being with us. I suppose the conversations that we've had about where we are recently, or at least in the new year, have focused on this kind of rapidly accelerating level of supply, at least, and the difficulty of countries since the supply has accelerated so much, since COVAX has passed this 1 billion dose kind of huge milestone, is the difficulty that many of these countries are having in absorbing these doses and getting these shots into arms. And from a campaigning perspective, obviously for us that's been incredibly tricky, because I think what I was quite keen to ask you is, have we sort of shot ourselves in the foot by over focusing on supply in the latter part of last year, where what incensed me so much was countries making big pledges of doses and a very small proportion of those pledges actually being delivered. We're now in a situation where the final few weeks of last year saw a huge uptick of doses being delivered, right? But we have, I think it's 32 low or middle income countries who have used even half of their COVAX doses so far. So the question is now, kind of with USAID saying that they're struggling with financing, with COVAX, I saw Seth Berkley in the FT either today or yesterday saying they're literally running out of cash. What is there that kind of, if you're saying that multilateralism is struggling so much, obviously it's difficult to hear, and we completely would agree here in the newsroom about the challenges involving the UK government, which has been, I think, all of us have been quite horrified by, really. I mean, just that Biden didn't even attend the summit that you mentioned. Not Biden, sorry, Johnson didn't even attend the summit that you mentioned. Biden didn't attend his own summit. I think something we're really grappling with is how, with a huge amount of apathy in the UK especially, but also now this much more complicated question of how we can build capacity via increasing the funding that these organisations have. What do you think the best routes to doing that are, especially I think within the UK context?
So those are all good questions. And look, you weren't wrong to be incensed by the gap between commitments and delivery, because one of the other problems, even though supply has increased, two things to think about. One is that the unpredictability, the absence of a roadmap for when doses were arriving was and remains a huge problem. And it's connected to this issue of getting shots in arms. If you don't have the lead time to know on what regular schedule you're going to get vaccines, you're making a complicated job harder. So don't take back your frustration with that. That was totally on point. I think the other thing is that USAID held a meeting in December to pull donors together on this delivery issue, and has been doing a lot of work since then, and I think is leaning in a direction. I'm no longer in government, but I think leaning in a direction of moving bigger on this delivery issue and think about it, in the UK or in the United States, putting on the mass vaccination campaigns that we have put on took a lot of extra resources, a lot of extra people. It took the private sector, it took mayors, it took all sorts of people. It's not an easy task, even in countries where regular immunization is in place. I think it's a bit of that glue problem. In the absence of glue, you don't have the sort of body that's sitting there saying, is everything covered? And I think the supply gap was so acute that was the most tangible, urgent thing that everybody focused on. And I think that was fine. I think now, yes, countries that are financing, countries that are receiving vaccines, the priority's got to shift to delivery and getting shots in arms, but it can't shift 100%. Because the other reality we're dealing with right now is Omicron and all the evidence we have of the efficacy, not just of vaccines, but of boosters. And so the demand for vaccines, and this is where I think, James, to some of your questions, I think we're at a pivot point where maybe the world can get a second chance to get it right early with Omicron, and what's going to be a long-term demand for a significant number of vaccines and for delivery, because we all know that this virus is going to be with us for a very long time. So how do we do a reset now is, I think, the big question.
And what's the answer to that?
I think, we're doing some work on that, and there's a lot of expertise out there, but I think on vaccines, while we're going to need to keep on the externally financed vaccines and vaccine sharing and so on, we're going to have to look more seriously at production of vaccines and more equitably geographically distributed production.
Mm-hmm.
And what's required there is not just resources, that's policy innovation. There's lots of talk about innovation in vaccines, and it's about the mRNA. We need the innovations in policy that mean that the world can very quickly build the capacity to produce more of these vaccines in more places, because the demand is going to be significant. So that's one piece that I think is going to be really very, very urgent.
Gayle, can I do a bit of directing traffic? Because there are lots of people, as you're talking,
yes,
have got
please.
kind of questions on different elements.
Sure.
I'd really like to bring in Edie Lush, because I'm hoping that Edie is still there somewhere. There she is. I heard Edie talk about how we deliver on the global goals when she was launching her podcast, the Global Goals Cast. And at the time, actually, Edie, I don't know whether you agree with this, but at the time we felt much more optimistic about kind of the international community pulling together. And so to an extent, I remember thinking, this is going to be brilliant. We're actually going to just discover how well we do at the things we've set ourselves. Now it's not even clear whether or not we're doing any of the things we set ourselves. So Edie had a question about COVAX. I'm going to bring Matt in on campaigning. I want to bring Karen Key in, if I may, in a moment, on compassion. But Edie, you had a point about COVAX.
Thank you, James. And yeah, as we know, we've slipped behind on most global goals since the pandemic. So you're absolutely right. My specific question around COVAX is that I wonder if you could give some analysis on how well it's worked or how it hasn't worked. When I've spoken to people from them on and off the record, they'd say that they were set up to deliver these vaccines. They've got the experience. But even from the beginning, countries were bypassing them, and they continue to bypass them. You heard there a moment ago about the money, but it's not just that. It's the deals done through COVAX. So I'd love to hear your analysis on what could be better.
So, James, do you want me to go ahead, or do you want to take a few? Okay. Look, I think COVAX was something that had to be created. And I think if we were to talk about a 2.0, there are a few things that we might want to think about. One is whether at the front end, there ought not to be more commitments, not just by wealthy countries that have the capital to buy vaccines, but quite frankly, by the manufacturers, to ensure that it's got a supply that will ultimately lead to more equitable distribution. Because part of the challenge to COVAX in the early days was getting on the market. Part of it was that donors made commitments but didn't provide the cash, and you can't go into negotiation with a vaccine company on a pledge. So I think there are a number of things like that could tweak it. I think it became challenging, but it wasn't an overwhelming challenge. When sharing escalated significantly, COVAX really wasn't built for that. The assumption underpinning COVAX was that money would be provided, COVAX would buy vaccines. The notion that vaccines would be donated, that's a lot of work. It's tricky. We spent a great deal of time with COVAX coordinating, and also with the bot, because a very positive initiative in this whole crisis was the decision by the African Union to set up its own mechanism for acquisition. And thank goodness they did, because the J&J doses that they bought arrived earlier than most of the doses that any donors provided. So there was a need for coordination there. I think, again, the challenge is that, and I think, and this is a reflection, so I'm not sure I'm 100% correct. I think the mindset was a little bit as though this is a crisis in the developing world. And so the donors have COVAX and all these things, and we should provide resources rather than, again, we are all in the same crisis. And if you start with we rather than us and them, then you start thinking about vaccines differently, right? This is a global pandemic. The whole world is screwed. How do we think about allocating vaccines? So,
and just out of
yeah.
Sorry, Gayle, just to explain, because I think Edie's right. I mean, either you had COVAX people saying, look, we're being undermined by the international community and particularly the powerful G7 countries, or to be fair, if you spoke to lots of people in Washington, certainly in the second half of last year, they were saying COVAX is not the delivery mechanism for this. Actually, the problem with the Biden administration is we should go and do it ourselves. We shouldn't be trying to operate through COVAX. And I wondered whether or not you thought those people had a point.
Sure, quite frankly, and I'm not sure I know what the difference is. I will tell you one thing, with the US shared doses, and the majority of that we did with and through, and is still going with and through COVAX. Part of that is sharing doses is a really complex operation where you've got legal, regulatory, all sorts of standards to check, indemnity, and COVAX has a lot of that built in. So that for all of those seemingly bureaucratic but ultimately necessary steps, it makes a difference than doing, for the US to have done literally hundreds, because we've done more deliveries, more than one delivery in many countries, of individual negotiations across all those things. So there is that. I think COVAX was not set up to succeed in the first year because it wasn't able to compete. Flip side, I think there are all sorts of ways you could improve COVAX. And I think we've got the opportunity to do that. We've learned a lot. What are the tweaks we need to make?
Is there, Gayle, can I, we're going to jump around a little bit, but I want to bring in my colleague, Matt Dancona, if I might, and then I'm going to come to David McNair and Karen Key in a minute. I don't know whether you have read, Gayle, but Matt wrote a book a few years ago called Post-Truth, which was rather brilliant. And if that wasn't depressing enough, he then, on one of these thinkings, then sort of set into post-shame, what had happened in our politics when actually you could no longer shame people to behaving differently. And then we had a particularly depressing conversation with him, and I don't even know whether Ben Maitland was there for that one, but it was essentially the idea of sort of post-care. What happens when Global Citizen says one thing and Harry and Meghan say another, and the one campaign has a kind of global week of action, and the sum of it is no one cares. And I just wondered, Matt, whether you just sort of put to Gayle your read on what's happened to politics and activism, you know, in the years since sort of, if you like, the high water mark of Glen Eagles.
Yeah, thanks, James, and hi, Gayle. It's great to see you. Slightly worried about being billed as the postman, but we'll try not to be a doom monger. I mean, I suppose in a way, as James said, that what worries me a lot is how we approach this problem and what frameworks we use. And you know, I'm old enough to have been very excited by Live Aid and then journalistically to have been, you know, really excited by Blood Eagles. And but I feel that the political systems and structures and narratives that govern that era are now, to put it most charitably, in decline, in the sense that seems to me an age where one could reasonably expect in activism, campaigning journalism, to pressurize multilateral systems into some form of action. Obviously, rarely would it meet the ideals of the campaign, but there would be some middle ground from which action emerged. What I found very depressing about the if you like, the first phase of trying to get vaccine equality, and this was sort of started by James's newscast on Carbis Bay, and I hope that there's a link to that in the chat, was this what then followed, which was really, it felt like the world's most pointless grand tour, that we were chasing after first the G7, then the G20, then the president's, summit during UNGA. And the promise always was the next meeting is going to be the one that generates the critical mass that will then yield an end to the vaccine hoarding, and not just that, but also generate a kind of consciousness, a global consciousness about the fact this was indeed a global crisis rather than one cantonized into national, units. And I suppose that what's disturbing about this is that we seem to be, we're at a moment where on climate change, on pandemics, we are more interdependent than ever before, not to mention economically. And yet we seem to be losing, if not the language of internationalism, then certainly the capacity to act internationally. One still hears heads of government using the old tropes and the old language of traditional multilateralism, traditional de-Nashson post-war multilateralism, but not really following through. And the worry, to put it in its sort of most bald fashion, is that the West is now has moved into a place where it's discussing when it can date the shift from pandemic into endemic, and has almost completely forgotten the base point that came out in a phrase which James and Laura and I talked about a lot, which was nobody's safe until everybody is safe, and how that just hadn't gained any traction. So we already know there's a variant of Omicron BA2, which is not necessarily as that severe, but it's already mutating. There's no reason to think that the virus won't continue to mutate in unvaccinated parts of the world. But that argument, that sort of has absolutely no campaigning bite at the moment. And I just wonder if can you offer us any sort of hope, as someone who knows so much about this, about how we can feed ideas and messages into the modern networked system that might actually bring about action?
Yeah, I think I'm obligated to answer that, because otherwise I'm going to be so depressed that it's like, what's the point? Well, things, and one of these gets to how we message, and one of this also gets to the media and the press. A really interesting thing, I don't know if you've seen it yet today, but a spokesman for Senator Sanders today made a couple of statements quite critical of the media for the way it has covered vaccine inequity versus the ongoing events in Ukraine. Now, there may have been some other points there. I don't think it was a suggestion that the media should not be covering what is going on in Ukraine, but Ukraine is covered as this looming crisis, urgency, hear the Jaws-like soundtrack running in the background. And I think maybe because it's a global health threat, maybe because it's not a threat posed by humans, but by a virus, I think that our coverage and our narratives are kind of soft on the one hand, and that we don't do enough. And some of this is media, some of this is campaigners, some of this is speakers, activists. We could all do better on this. How do we do a better job of making clear that it's a threat, but also making more stark the fact that yes, it is grossly unfair, but your ability in London or in the United States to get your kids back in school to some extent depends on this pandemic being ended everywhere. And the slogan works, everybody says it, you're absolutely right. No one is safe until anybody's safe. But how do we connect those dots better in our messaging, I think, is number one. I think for decision makers and political leaders, how do we connect the dots better on something like the pressure right now in global supply chains? I guarantee you that has the attention of every leader in the G7. That is and more. That's a real cause for concern. Go deeper on the fact that, again, if you want to solve the problem right now with chips, we all know where it came from, right? it's predominantly because of the pandemic. And how do we drive that harder, more sharply, and perhaps more starkly to really give the kind of feel and texture to the threat that this really is? Because I think a lot of people look at this globally and it's like, oh, it's a global health thing. Those global health people can deal with it, or the development types can deal with it. And we've got to stop talking to ourselves and shift the language. But I think there's another piece to your looking back at the past and what drove a lot of that. And I think compassion and caring about the world and social justice was one of those things. Look, I remember when George Bush launched PEPFAR, one of the things that enabled that was widely covered here was something that was at the time called compassionate conservatism. One of my concerns is we don't have enough voices out there, the same number of voices, the kinds of voices that we did back then, talking about compassion and values. And it's really stark. I thought about this when Desmond Tutu died. Who is now, if you look back at the early days of the AIDS fight, if you look back at the Drop the Debt campaigns, faith leaders, for example, were of huge significance from across the spectrum. And I'm not saying it's entirely their responsibility, but I do look around the world and say we've got fewer voices with the moral authority. Yeah, go ahead.
I wanted to put to you that. So in a curious way, I'm cross with us, right? Us being us, Tortoise, us, the media, us, even, people like the One Campaign, who are all making the same argument in the face of a politics that we know has changed, right? And why don't we have the imagination to figure out a different way of trying to move the dial? And the reason I say that is, you may not like Donald Trump, you may not like Brexit, you may not like the drift of politics, but what those people have said is, bluntly, there are no votes in this, right? You can put on a 24-hour music telethon, or you can have some social media messaging about a more compassionate world, but when push comes to shove, there are not votes in this, and so I'm not going to expend excessive energy on it. And if we recognize that, you may disagree with that view, but if you recognize that, then surely campaigners who are trying to look at things like some kind of global equity, sustainability, a COVID vaccination program, we've got to get smarter about figuring out which buttons to push, because the ones we're pushing aren't working.
Though there may not be a lot of votes in go mount a huge, robust international response. There are a whole lot of votes in whether this pandemic ends in the short term or we continue to go through cycles like Omicron. There's a whole lot of votes in that everywhere.
But even that, Gayle, just sorry to be, but even that, I worry that people go, well, look, you know what, that's true, but we've discovered that if we vaccinate ourselves, we're by and large okay.
Except that that's not true. Like, that's not true. I mean, look at what just happened with Omicron.
Yeah, true.
Now, it was you can argue it was a short surge, but I think there's a real danger, and I think including a political danger, in saying, oh, well, it's going to be endemic. Endemic doesn't mean gone, and it doesn't mean undeadly. Endemic is still around. So I would argue that there's political peril and votes at play in leaving this unchecked outside the borders of any of our countries. Now, do we make that argument well enough? I don't know. Another point, somebody just put in the chat something about, where's the Larry Kramer and the ACT UP if you go back to the early AIDS days? I think that's another question. Is I believe, as somebody who's been in government and who's been outside government as an advocate and an activist, that you got to apply the pressure, and then you got to give credit to governments when they do the right thing, right? But I think, quite frankly, upping the bar in terms of expectations is something that ought to be done. I think, we just did some polling, some global and some within the United States, and there's lot of evidence that people support global vaccine equity and getting more vaccines to more people around the world. Do we need to up the expectation we have of leaders and do more to hold them accountable? And again, give them credit when they act. I think the other thing, James, and I think one of the things that one has as an asset, and they're called youth ambassadors, one champions, different things in different countries, is I really think voices of young people matter, and voices of young people in numbers matter. If for no other reason, the politicians know that they vote and they're going to vote for a very long time. And I, in my own reflection of, as we enter into year 3, and I'm like, what in the world? Like, how did this happen? Anyway,
I'm just going to interrupt because I just want to bring in Karen Key, because Karen picked up on the point very early on about compassion. Karen, I don't know whether you're still there. Yes, there you are.
Yeah.
Very nice backdrop.
Yeah. Hold on, you're muted, Karen. I don't know whether that's us or you.
Am I unmuted now?
Yeah, got you. Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, I created the backdrop as soon as that beautiful memorial was created. So I just wanted to offer that the environment in which leaders are attempting to send the right public health messages, to also inspire compassion, we're swimming in polluted water because of social media. So the problem of how social media optimizes for content that triggers the amygdala, right? So rage and fear, positive messages will always lose in a direct competition in the current state of social media. So I feel as if the administration, for example, is pilloried. And of course, the administration has made mistakes, but the reality is most people don't think about the fact that they're not getting a full picture, and that what they're getting, that they're paying attention to, is privileged by the fact that it's optimized to make people angry and frightened. And so I feel like if we don't address the infodemic and the reality of the fact that of what's happening with social media, we can never get purchase the way we want to. And I'm interested in, there's a book called How to Talk to Science Deniers. There's a whole movement about something called technique rebuttal, which is saying instead of arguing with people about the content, you have a discussion with them that takes them to look at their thought process, because clearly arguing with people is not working, right? So I'm just interested in thoughts about how we get to that root cause, because I feel as if no matter how much pressure is put on officials, on leaders, on public health and communicators, they're still putting their content into this kind of toxic medium. So I'd be very interested to hear thoughts about that.
I think you are 10,000% right. And your language on we're swimming in polluted waters is 100% correct, including on the social media side. And frankly, it's one of the things I worry about the most. I don't know that I've got the answers to that, because it's not only the misinformation, it is legitimized the notion that science is a matter of opinion. And that's some pretty dangerous ground. If science is a matter of opinion, then what's the basis for any of the decisions we make? And how we push back against that is, I think, one of the greatest challenges we have at a profound level, at a political level, at a social level, but also in terms of ending the pandemic, because it's also one of the reasons that countries like the United States and others, in terms of vaccine coverage, have hit a wall. Like, we've gotten a certain coverage and you can't get beyond it because you've got people whose source of information is the kind of negative, false disinformation that you describe. I think it's one of the biggest challenges of our time. I'm not, to be perfectly honest, I'm not sure what the answer is. I think what we know from a lot of places, I think our own countries, is that the best counter are locally trusted, leaders and trusted individuals. But it's not individuals that are then on social media. It's trusted individuals that are meeting people in person are the most effective at pushing back.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, I didn't I didn't expect to get out of bed this morning thinking I need to choose between Neil Young and Joe Rogan, but I don't know whether you saw, you know, actually you do need to choose between Neil Young and Joe Rogan. And, you know, in any circumstance you choose Neil Young, but on this particular issue, I don't know whether everyone saw, he said you wouldn't have his music on Spotify given Joe Rogan's comment on
But at least he laid down a marker. And
yeah. I thought it was great. Listen, Gail, can I just bring in your colleague David McNair? David, just because, you know, Gail mentioned some of this polling, and I think it is really interesting in helping us to understand a bit like about this kind of compassion issue. What's your read on what's happened? Are we being unnecessarily skeptical about the mood that's out there?
Well, first of all, some of the polling that we commissioned told us that in G7 countries, but also in Nigeria and in Senegal, large parts of the population don't know that there's a problem when it comes to the international vaccination issues. Where they do understand that it's a problem, they blame low-income countries for not having enough money or not being organized enough to buy their vaccines. So there's clearly a kind of a shift that needs to happen there in terms of, you know, dispelling that that perception. But in terms of your question about the mood, I mean, one thing that I've been thinking about, and this relates back to Matthew's comment, is just this idea that everything's being weaponized. It might be Spotify, it might be economic policy, it might be, you know, vaccines, it might be migrants. But in that kind of context, and Mark Leonard from European Council on Foreign Relations makes this argument really well, then it is kind of every person for themselves. So that's one thing that we've been hearing from a lot of African partners. You know, they want to get their economies back on track so that they can afford to buy their own vaccines, manage their own, you know, pandemic, and, you know, prioritize their own things. So one question that is in my mind is, are we too focused on vaccines? And should we be focused instead on the economic, or as well on the economic implications of the pandemic and addressing that, and then addressing the rules that have led us into that situation regarding, you know, debt sustainability and so on?
Can I just ask a question, David? Because when we started in our own little way, we got some pushback from like properly smart people who know and understand the issues. You know, I remember Peter Sands at the Global Fund saying, "Look, don't just get your head around vaccines. Think about the whole Act A agenda." And then, as you say, others were saying, "Look, you need to then think about the knock-on economics." And I remember thinking, no, we've got to keep something really simple, because otherwise the idea of trying to sort of bail out the rest of the world is too hard to understand. And even on the narrow point of vaccines and vaccine funding, it's been hard to develop a coalition. So the worry I've got about your point, which is think about post-pandemic support globally, is I find it even harder to see how the international community gets around that.
Actually, David, if I can just chime in here, I think, James, you make a good point, but one of the interesting things is one of the places, and David, you may want to say more about this, where the world has actually come together in many ways more effectively is on the SDRs, is on the economic impact. Now, it's not there yet, but interestingly, there does seem to be some recognition there that I think is not insignificant.
And is there also something happening here? The SDRs you mentioned, you know, it's interesting that the leadership, at least from where we sit around these issues, Gail, have come from unlikely places. You know, you wouldn't have thought that Kristalina Georgieva at the IMF, it's not an obvious thing for the International Monetary Fund to say we're going to get back into this. She's been there. Ngozi at the WTO, she's been there. But it also is an odd thing where there hasn't been that kind of leadership, right? And I wonder what that tells you, whether or not in the end, it's just a question of good people. I mean, whether or not it's not institutions, it's good people.
I think it's both, but I think it's those two examples make clear that leadership really matters.
Yeah.
No, you wouldn't expect the IMF to be the institution out there putting out a plan or being the strongest and most passionate and quite frankly fact-driven, given the economics of it, champion of global vaccine coverage. Who would have thought? A lot of that is Kristalina's own experience, background, where she comes from. She's got a career that has been characterized by, I think, this notion that if you don't have equity, you do have problems. Similarly with Ngozi. So I think leadership does matter. I think the fact that, again, though, we have not seen the international institutions come together in the more natural way that used to, again, be the default only 5-10 years ago. I think that begs a question. Why isn't that happening?
Yeah, I think particularly given that in 2020, the curious thing was that people were talking about global health as the mechanism that would actually galvanize global action, international cooperation, and it hasn't been that. Gayle, I just want to bring in Claire Montague.
Yeah.
Claire's a member of Tortoise. We talked a fair bit before, Claire, sometimes about, the politics when you were in government and how far that's changed. And Gayle talked about the changing role of the UK in this community. Would you just help us sort of put together the way you see what's happened in domestic politics and how that's affected what happens internationally?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I suppose my sense is that I think domestic political concerns have always been voters' primary kind of care. I think the difference in shift in the last 10 years has been politicians, and particularly Trump and Johnson, calling the bluff of multilateral institutions and saying, actually, my voters may express good things about multilateralism, but fundamentally voters only really care about domestic politics. And certainly I was in government in the aughts up to sort of 2010, and there was no question for politicians at the time that domestic matters came first, but that we had international obligations, either as part of the G7 or as part of the EU then, or wherever. And I wonder whether, as soon as that bluff is called, there aren't any votes actually in tracing kind of commitments through the G7. And it doesn't matter how much we say to people, yes, but we're not all safe until everyone is safe. Fundamentally, if you believe as a populist politician that your next vote is only in individual domestic matters and cost of living, and I'm all right, Jack, because I've been vaccinated, even if Omicron has come over from South Africa, it becomes very hard, I think, to recreate the case for multilateralism. And of course, as soon as one politician calls it out and one country flakes on its commitments, what is the incentive then for everyone else to maintain? And what is the incentive for our next government to recreate DFID and our leadership internationally, when actually Boris Johnson has been able to get away with, and Rishi Sunak have got away with all of that, and no one really gives a toss, frankly. And I mean, I end up with you, James, kind of really, really depressed about how you create a sense of obligation when politicians have shown you can get away without that obligation.
Well, the one thing I'm really struck here, I've always believed that I don't ever want to be cynical or depressed. I'm sure you don't either. So I'm going to cling desperately to, oh my God, what does one say after that? But if you look at multilateralism came out of crisis. Mm-hmm. And, it may be that historically, not in the next 6 weeks, but it may be that historically, multilateralism is going to have to be reinvented out of what is without question going to be a crisis. Because, and again, I'm cribbing a bit from Kristalina here, but one of the arguments that she makes very well is that, and to David's point, is that with this pandemic unchecked, and this notion that we can just vaccinate ourselves and boost ourselves every few months in the wealthy countries and live with it, we're going to see huge health consequences, and we're going to see huge economic consequences. Or if you look at the data that just come out on education in Africa, where the setbacks are, it's going to take at least a decade, if not more, to recover from that. And what we're going to have is a very divergent world, where some countries can go in some direction and some countries can't. That's going to be a more dangerous world, arguably. So I think, there is a question about whether there will come a point where people recognize that our failure to collaborate institutionally or internationally is at our peril. Rather than, Claire, I think you're absolutely right. The narrative that's being put out now, and I think is growing predominant, is we don't really need to care about anybody else. You've got countries all over the world, and we can manufacture everything here. We don't need to have relations with these other countries. We don't need to be dependent on anybody. Who needs the UN? Who cares about those countries? Again, it's a set of dangerous propositions. I agree that with Claire that the narrative is an easy one and it's an appealing one. It's probably more appealing than the counter argument. But I think we know enough of history to know that it's a dangerous position to be in. Maybe we need to start teaching history a bit better.
And Gayle, can I ask you, Claire, thank you. Can I just ask you just sort of in a hyper practical way, one of the things we're trying to do is just map out the year. And as Matt said, the slight concern we've got is that we're sort of a, caravan following, or not even a caravan, a dog following the caravan, maybe even a tortoise following the caravan of international events, and as did last year, you have the G7, then you have UNGA, then you have G20, and now they're going to be a host of other summits at which things nearly but not quite happen. How do you, from one campaign's point of view, and for us thinking about this issue, how do you map out 2022? What are the sort of tentpole moments? How do you organise so that things happen?
Well, I mean, you've referenced a number of the events that are going to be key. Obviously, President Biden's going to have another summit. There's a G7, there's a G20, there's bank fund meetings. There's a whole calendar of events. I think what is going to determine whether those events are in fact platforms for major steps forward is going to be a couple of things. One is, again, how we as activists and advocates set our expectations. And I think there's always the danger of being in the stance where so long as the government does more and announces something, then it's like, yay. And the bar needs to be collectively, y'all need to do enough. I think the second goes back to something I said at the beginning, which is how do we do more as people who live in the world of global public health or development or social justice, do a better job of putting the consequences of failure in terms that perhaps some of these decision makers will understand, and holding them accountable and connecting the dots and saying, yes, the reason that you're paying 22% more for a car right now is because of the supply chain pressure. And that's because these people haven't gotten their act together to stop the damn pandemic yet. Connect the dots and I think show what the consequences are in a way that makes a difference. And then I think the third, and this is not to, look, I say this as a former journalist who would like to be one again. I'm very struck by this thing I mentioned earlier of how do we cover this, whether it's us talking about it, whether it's reporters writing about it. And I really want to think through this notion, how do we cover something like Ukraine or a war or a conventional threat versus how are we covering this? And I'm not sure that we are covering this and talking about this in a way that is as stark and sharp-edged as we need to be, given the nature of the threat. Because I'm all for Omicron being the last surge. I'm not naive. It is, in my view, at least 50% chance that we're going to get another variant that may be both faster and stronger.
Gayle, thank you. It's very funny listening to you there just at the end, possibly maybe a bit like you, because you can have compassion fatigue, but you can also have disillusion fatigue, which makes you suddenly reach for reasons to be optimistic. I was struck by sort of three things. One was just personal, which is that the more I look around, the more I think to myself that the most important quality in any efforts around social justice is tirelessness. It's just the willingness just to keep on going. And you personally and that gang and one, if anything, seem to me to embody tirelessness. And I suppose we as a newsroom should just take a lesson from that, just to keep on going, and we'll do that. But I think there are two things here. One is, I do think the fact that the old mechanisms aren't working, whether they're the multilateral mechanisms in government, or if you like, the old tropes and types of activism globally that kind of enrage us and engage our compassion. There's an opportunity there for a rethinking. And if you're in our line of work trying to think about the world differently, that's actually quite an energizing problem to have. And then I was just listening to you and just thinking, the interesting thing is that, and now I'm going to sound like an old lag here, but there is something in which I think the generation gap will help us with the power gap. It's really interesting, even in our newsroom, whenever we sit down and have an editorial meeting, I'm really struck by the fact that the things that I necessarily think are at the top of the news agenda are not necessarily the things that colleagues of mine who are much younger think are at the top of the news agenda. And as we both know, there's no such thing as a news agenda. It's just a group of people coming together and trying to figure out what's important. And I think that potentially will drive us to see things differently, because we will see health differently, we will see mental health differently, we will see inequality of opportunity and outcomes differently as a result of this pandemic. And so I'd like to think that we will reach a new way of thinking about the way the world comes, partly driven by that generation gap. But as ever, I just wanted to also say thank you for your time, because it's really helpful for us to begin to understand what things are like on the inside, government and campaigning. And if we can do things that are helpful together, please say we'll
because it's going to take all of us. And I want to thank everybody. I love these events. I'm just going to say a quick thing, James, to something you said, which is tirelessness, absolutely critical. But so is the constant questioning of our assumptions. My key takeaway from serving for the third time in government is I'm on a very different planet than I was when I was in the Obama administration. It's just the landscape has changed dramatically. So I think we owe it to ourselves and the things for which we fight to constantly be asking ourselves, what are the things that are driving the decisions of political leaders today? Claire got to some of that. What's really shaping it? If you got to talk to people where they are, not where you think they should be, where do you start on that? What are some of the new obstacles we face? I think, Karen, you got to that obviously with your swimming in a polluted information environment. But what are some of the opportunities we have? And I think on the flip side, we've got technological information opportunities. But I think if we don't constantly check our assumptions, grade ourselves on that worked, that didn't, and then iterate, well, then you're just going to end up tireless but tired. So
okay, that's a very, very good qualification. Let's be tireless and let's question our assumptions. That seems like a good way to end. Gayle, thank you again. Thank you
everybody. Pleasure.
And if you're joining us tomorrow evening, 6:30 London time, we've got a circus of our own to investigate. So we'll be discussing that tomorrow night.
Cake parties, huh?
Yeah, exactly. Thanks very much, everyone. Have a good evening.